Austria has long been a destination for cold weather travelers from around the world, drawn to the region by soaring mountains and some of the most spectacular ski resorts on Earth. These world-famous ski destinations include St. Anton, Kitzbühel, Solden, as well as the Zelmsee region just southeast of Salzburg. Zelmsee is home to a famous glacier known as Kitzsteinhorn, the first ski glacier in the Austrian Alps. First established in 1907, for almost 100 years, Kitzsteinhorn enjoyed a long history synonymous with challenging ski terrain and exceptional scenery. Sadly, the resort's longtime association with world-class skiing would be permanently overshadowed by the dark cloud of tragedy. It would become the site of one of the worst ski disasters in recorded history on November 11th, 2000. Opened in 1974, the Gletscherbahn 2 was a mostly subterranean funicular railway system connecting the town of Kaprun, Austria, with the Kitzsteinhorn Glacier as its upper terminus. 2 trains capable of carrying as many as 180 passengers each traversed a single 12,800-foot-long track. Of the total length, more than 10,000 feet of track ran through a mountain tunnel. At the midway point, the track widened, allowing trains to pass each other. Each train served as a counterweight, with a powerful motor positioned at the upper station, capable of controlling the entire system. Shortly after 9 a.m. on the morning of November 11th, 2000, 161 snowboarders and skiers, along with a single operator, boarded the Gletscherbahn 2 at the lower terminus station, ready for a beautiful day on the Kitzsteinhorn Glacier. As the train pulled out of the station and began its ascent up the 30-degree incline, a small fan heater in the unattended operator cabin at the lower end of the train began to overheat. The small plastic components in the device began to smolder, causing a small fire. With the fire undetected, the train continued its ascent up the incline, approaching the mouth of the tunnel. The small fire began to spread, coming into contact with plastic pipes carrying flammable hydraulic fluid. As the pipes started to melt, the hydraulic fluid ignited, engulfing the lower end of the train. By now, the train had entered the tunnel. Smoke filled the bottom half of the train, causing passengers to panic. As the fire began to spread, pressure loss in the train's hydraulic piping would trigger a safety system and cause the train to come to a halt about 2,000 feet into the tunnel. The operator on the upper end of the train soon became aware of the fire as passengers continued to panic. By this time, smoke had spread through the entire train. The operator would attempt to contact the upper station control center. However, communication was lost. The fire had burned through a power cable that ran along the tracks through the tunnel, causing a blackout across the entire resort. The operator would attempt to open the hydraulic doors, allowing passengers to evacuate. However, due to the hydraulic pressure loss, the doors remained shut. Frantic passengers repeatedly attempted to break the shatterproof windows, to no avail. Finally, a group of 12 passengers toward the lower end of the train managed to break one of the windows. At the advice of a fellow escapee who had served as a volunteer firefighter, those passengers would travel downward past the fire to safety. On the burning train, after repeated attempts, the operator was finally able to open the train doors. Passengers spilled out onto the narrow walkway running alongside the track, ascending upward through the tunnel, away from the burning train. By now, smoke had reached the upper station complex, which was called the Alpen Center. The building was home to a busy restaurant, a shop, and the upper funicular station. When employees in the station first noticed smoke, they quickly alerted occupants in the Alpen Center and began to evacuate. During the evacuation, large doors were left open in an attempt to ventilate the now smoke-filled building. However, the resulting chimney effect would lead to an intensification of the fire. As toxic smoke billowed through the tunnel, passengers that had escaped the burning train who were traveling upward along the track would soon be overcome by smoke and ultimately perished in the fire. In all, the disaster claimed the lives of 155 people, 150 from the ascending train, 2 from the descending train, and 3 in the mountain station, making it the worst ski resort disaster in history. An official investigation concluded that the fire was in fact caused by the faulty fan heater in the operator's cab at the lower end of the train. The funicular was permanently shut down after the accident and would not reopen. The tunnel was sealed, and the trestle remained standing for the next 14 years until it was dismantled completely in 2014. In the northeastern corner of Italy exists a small mountain commune known as Cavalese. Geographically located among the Italian Dolomites, Cavalese sits in a valley surrounded by skyscraping mountains and truly remarkable scenery. Beyond the region's beauty, the area is a renowned summer destination for hikers and a winter hub for skiers and snowboarders. One of the major ski resorts connected by Cavalese is known as Alpe Cermis, home to a world-class collection of ski runs totaling more than 23 kilometers in length. Between the busy mountain resort above and the bustling town of Cavalese below, the region is an idyllic recreational destination, branded as a bright, vibrant place, but hiding an unfortunate and tragic past. In 1968, the Alpe Cermis Resort opened a new state-of-the-art aerial tramway system connecting the town of Cavalese with its mid-mountain terminus at just over 3,200 feet in elevation. The 3-mile-long system featured 2 large gondolas that ran along support cables opposite each other, shuttling ski resort guests up and down the mountain. The new aerial tramway system was a critical investment for the resort. Through the mid-1960s, as the resort enjoyed growing popularity among vacationers from Italy, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, and France, Alpe Cermis was in need of higher capacity equipment to handle the growing volume of guests. But even with the addition of the new aerial tramway, Alpe Cermis struggled to accommodate the record numbers of guests flocking to the resort year over year. As a result, management acknowledged that unpalatable conditions, such as lengthy lines for the lifts, were contributing to lower guest satisfaction. And given the competitive nature of ski resorts in the region, plans were drafted quickly to address the operational issues. One of the strategies employed to address capacity issues was to operate the tramway at a faster speed, a tactic highly discouraged by the lift manufacturer. Against the guidelines published in the lift's official operations and safety manual, resort management increased the average speed of the aerial tramway, cutting the trip from 6.5 minutes to 5.5 minutes. At the new, higher speed, when a filled gondola passed over a support pylon, the tension and weight caused instability between the static support cables and the haul cable responsible for moving the cabins. Operations staff had noted instances where the support and haul cables crossed and came into contact with one another, As this had happened on multiple occasions, operations management manually disengaged a standard safety feature that automatically shut down the system when it detected that cables had crossed. On the evening of March 9th, 1976, 44 passengers, including 2 operators, boarded the aerial tramway at the Mid-Mountain Station in preparation for their return trip to the town of Cavalese. The fully loaded cabin was packed with skiers and their equipment returning from a day on the mountain. As the loaded gondola descended down the mountain, it approached the final pylon, roughly 700 feet from the base station. It rolled up onto the pylon as the guide wheels kept the cable in line. But the tension release on the cables would create a bouncing effect, which caused the moving haul cable to cross the support cable, severing it with force. The massive support cable collapsed, whipping toward the base station, where it smashed through windows. The gondola rolled off the pylon and plunged more than 200 feet to the ground. Upon impact, the car was completely crushed by the 3-ton metal carriage assembly that sits on top of the cabin, instantly killing most of the passengers. The haul cable, still moving, dragged the entirety of the wreckage another 300 feet, suffocating those that were still alive before coming to rest just 400 feet from the base station. 43 people were killed in what is now regarded as one of the worst cable car accidents in history. A 14-year-old girl who was on a school trip was the only survivor. An inquest into the accident found culpability among resort officials who were shown to blatantly disregard safety mandates imparted by the cable car manufacturer. The accident soon made headlines around the world and left the small commune of Cavalese reeling. It would take decades for the town to recover from its association with the accident. But as a new generation of skiers descended upon Cermis into the 1990s, the resort had returned to growth with expanded terrain and new lift systems. The future was looking bright, with resort officials optimistic for the dawn of a new millennium. However, as the new millennium drew near, darkness would once again return to Cavalese. The same aerial tramway line would suffer yet another horrific tragedy on February 3rd, 1998, an incident known the world over as the Cermis Massacre. This mini-documentary is a continuation of the story of Cavalese, a small commune geographically located in the northeast corner of Italy among the soaring Dolomite Mountains. The town, along with the neighboring ski resort, Cermis, was the site of one of the worst cable car disasters in history. In 1976, the aerial tramway that connected Cavalese with the mid-mountain station on Cermis suffered a mechanical and structural failure, sending a loaded gondola plunging to the ground for more than 200 feet. 43 people were killed in the horrifying accident that made headlines around the world. In the subsequent decades, the town worked to recover and shed its association with the 1976 disaster. The town experienced a renaissance with a growing population of residents working to serve an even faster growing population of tourists. Through the early 1990s, the town would thrive, reclaiming its title as one of the top ski destinations in Italy. But that transformation would come to a sudden halt on the afternoon of February 3rd, 1998, in the shadow of an unimaginable tragedy. On February 3rd, 1998, the crew of an EA-6B Prowler aircraft of the United States Marine Corps took off from Aviano Air Force Base in Italy, embarking on a training mission through the Dolomite Mountains at low altitude. A normal low-level flight plan would call for the plane to maintain an altitude of at least 2,000 feet and a speed of no more than 450 knots, which was in line with military safety regulations. However, during the briefing, a minimum altitude of just 1,000 feet was set forth as the guideline. The crew joked and laughed in lighthearted conversation as they turned up the engines, peeled down the runway, and became airborne. First in command was Captain Richard J. Ashby, who at just 30 years old would need to complete this one last mission in order to receive a coveted promotion. Ashby was accompanied by his navigator, Captain Joseph Schweitzer, and crewmen Chandler Seagraves and William Rainey. The flight was planned the month prior, at an altitude of just 1,000 feet. As the aircraft soared over the undulating topography across the region, playful banter between the four aviators continued. One of them, with a video camera, was recording, capturing the group's antics while on flight. With the crew encouraging one another, informality quickly became recklessness. Captain Richard Ashby began performing risky maneuvers, increasing speed well beyond the 450-knot guidance, and flying well below even the erroneous minimum altitude of 1,000 feet. The aircraft soon entered a mountainous region, flying at a dangerously low altitude, weaving through valleys, and flying over small villages set among the peaks. Just after 3 p.m. local time, the aircraft would come upon a small, snowy village packed with tourists. As the plane flew over the village, the crew felt a sudden, violent jolt, concurrent with a loud thud. The aircraft had come into contact with something. The crew was stunned, not knowing what they had just hit. Could it have been a large bird, perhaps? What was clear is that whatever it was took a toll on the aircraft. One of the crewmen observed an enormous gash in the right side of one of the wings, and looking back, noticed a small, distant, yellow box falling to the ground. Though the plane's wing and tail were damaged, the crew managed to land safely back at Aviano Air Force Base. Soon, it became clear that the aircraft had struck an aerial cable car line. The plane's wing had come into contact with the support cables at an altitude of just 350 feet, severing them and sending the gondola with 20 passengers on board plummeting to the ground. There were no survivors. An official investigation into the cause of the crash uncovered a web of lies. In an effort to get rid of evidence, the videotape was destroyed. During the trial, the crew denied responsibility, maintaining that their altimeter was faulty, among other excuses. In March 1999, both Ashby and Schweitzer were acquitted by a U.S. court, and all manslaughter charges were dropped. The Italian public was outraged, alongside all of the other countries represented in the list of casualties, including Germany, Belgium, Poland, Austria, and the Netherlands. After the first trial, evidence of the destroyed videotape would surface and precipitate a second trial that would ultimately hold Ashby and Schweitzer accountable for obstruction of justice. Both would be discharged from service, and Ashby would ultimately serve just 4.5 months of a 6-month prison sentence, released for good behavior. The U.S. would issue an official apology to Italy and offered monetary compensation to the victims' families. However, the incident would significantly strain relations between the two countries. The incident to this day has been broadly acknowledged by Italians and Europeans, not as an accident, but instead as a massacre. It's been more than 20 years since this horrific tragedy. As an example of human resilience, the commune of Cavalese would move on and continue to build toward a bright future, leaving behind a very dark legacy. The fact that two major cable car disasters could impact the same town in the same manner, but under such different circumstances, is truly unfathomable. We can only hope that lessons have been learned and measures have been implemented to mitigate the risk of a similar tragedy in the future. The island of Tenerife is a wildly popular tourist destination. As one of Spain's 8 Canary Islands, the beautiful oasis enjoys year-round spring-like weather, perfect for the countless vacationers who come to enjoy its beautiful beaches and luxury resorts. But underneath the shroud of this bright, sunny vacation mecca hides a tragically dark past, one that has haunted the island for more than 30 years. In 1977, Tenerife was the site of a horrific accident, the deadliest disaster in the history of commercial aviation. The disaster at Tenerife Los Rodeos Airport was the result of multiple catastrophic failures. It was 1977. The Boeing 747, Queen of the Skies, had only been in use for 8 years, having been introduced in 1969. It was considered to be the most impressive and glamorous commercial airliner ever built, not to mention, among the safest. On March 27, 1977, Pan Am Flight 1736 and KLM Flight 4805 would be involved in an extraordinary accident. The Pan Am flight, with mostly Americans on board, originated in Los Angeles and had made a stopover in New York before continuing on to what was supposed to be Gran Canaria. The KLM flight was a charter that originated in Amsterdam, also destined for Gran Canaria. Just hours before both planes were scheduled to arrive, a terrorist group detonated a bomb at the Gran Canaria Airport. The group, called the Canary Islands Independence Movement, claimed responsibility for the bomb that injured 8 people. The bombing caused widespread panic at the airport, and anonymous phone calls made shortly thereafter claimed that more bombs had been planted. The airport immediately closed, while police worked to secure the facility. This meant that several incoming flights, including the KLM and Pan Am 747s, would be diverted to Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport until it was safe to reopen the Gran Canaria Airport. The search for the bombs took hours. Meanwhile, at the Tenerife Airport, in order to avoid overwhelming the small terminal with people, Pan American Captain Grubbs decided to keep all 380 passengers and 13 crew members on the plane while they waited on the tarmac. Transcripts from the cockpit voice recorders would later reveal that Captain Grubbs and his crew handled the whole situation very calmly. Meanwhile, on the KLM Boeing 747, Captain Jacob Van Zanten allowed all of the passengers to disembark and wander around the terminal until it was time for them to depart. Transcripts from recordings aboard the KLM jet reveal that they were tense and on edge. They discussed strict government overtime rules and what it could mean for the crew if they were late arriving back into Amsterdam. KLM Captain Van Zanten made a decision that under any normal circumstance would have been harmless, but on that day, it ended up being just another step toward disaster. While the flight was awaiting clearance to depart, Captain Van Zanten ordered the plane to be refueled. Ironically, just as the plane had begun the refueling process, the Gran Canaria Airport reopened. Despite the fact that they were in a hurry to leave, they were required to wait for the fueling process to complete. The KLM plane was partially blocking the taxiway while it refueled, while smaller aircraft that had also been diverted to Tenerife were able to pass safely. The Pan Am 747, which was parked behind the KLM plane, was too large. One more compounding factor: with the addition of fuel, the KLM 747 was much heavier and would need to use more runway to become safely airborne. And to make matters even worse, the delay would mean that a thick blanket of fog would descend from the mountains and settle over the airport. The normal route to get to the runway was blocked. This meant that planes preparing to take off would have to taxi down the runway and then navigate a 180-degree turn so that they could take off in the opposite direction. This is called a back taxi and is a rare operational procedure at commercial airports. And because there was no precise tracking radar available, and vision from the control tower had been impeded by the fog, Captain Van Zanten and Captain Grubbs didn't know that they were both on the runway at the same time. The KLM 747 received instructions from the control tower to taxi down the runway, turn around, and then hold until permission was granted for takeoff. The Pan Am 747 was told to proceed to a left-wide taxiway and wait for the KLM 747 to leave, then would be told to move back onto the runway and perform the same back taxi maneuver. Because visibility was so bad, Captain Grubbs missed where the plane was supposed to turn off the runway. Normally, something like this wouldn't be a problem, but this meant that the Pan Am flight remained on the runway, unbeknownst to the KLM crew. Captain Grubbs on the Pan Am flight was looking for the next turnoff, while Captain Van Zanten on the KLM flight was completing the 180-degree turn on the far end of the runway. First Officer Klaus Mers on the KLM flight received route clearance from the tower, but not clearance for takeoff. Everyone was tired, irritable, and eager to just leave. And for reasons that are still not fully understood, the flight crew aboard the KLM flight mistook the route clearance as permission to take off as they turned up the engines and initiated their takeoff roll. The Pan Am crew saw the lights of the KLM 747 emerge out of the fog. Captain Grubbs set the thrust levers to full power and tried to steer the plane off of the runway and into a field beside it, but he was too late. When Captain Van Zanten saw that he was about to collide with the Pan Am jet, all he could do was try and get the plane into the air faster by pulling back on the elevators. He gained altitude, but it wasn't enough. The underside of the KLM 747 slammed into the Pan Am 747's midsection, setting off a series of devastating explosions. The KLM plane lost control, crashed back down on the runway, and skidded more than 1,000 feet before it burst into a massive fireball. All 248 passengers and crew aboard the KLM flight perished. All but 61 passengers on board the Pan Am flight were killed. 583 lives were lost that day, making it the worst disaster in the history of commercial aviation. This extraordinary tragedy would result in sweeping changes to international airline regulations, as aviation authorities have applied critical learnings from the accident to minimize circumstantial gaps in communication. Progress toward overall better air safety should be attributed to the memory of the 583 lives lost. In the early hours of December 3rd, 1984, thousands of people lay sleeping in their homes in the central Indian city of Bhopal. Little did they know, a nightmare was taking shape nearby. Over 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas silently leaked from the Union Carbide pesticide plant, immediately killing at least 3,800 people and causing significant morbidity and premature death for thousands more. Over 500,000 people were inadvertently exposed to the toxic gas. This event would later be considered one of the worst industrial accidents in history. The Union Carbide plant employed nearly 700 residents. Many came from lower-class households and resided in the immediate vicinity. The plant itself looked like a metal graveyard, with hundreds of pipes weaving in and around each other. Additionally, the facility was littered with safety hazards. There were 61 violations identified in an inspection conducted just before the incident. Tragically, these threats only set the scene for the disaster that was to come. The chemical at the center of the Bhopal disaster was methyl isocyanate, also known as MIC. This chemical was produced and stored underground in 3 separate tanks, and safety guidelines were in place to ensure that these tanks were properly monitored. The tanks were meant to be no more than half full at all times. The remaining space was pressurized, preventing moisture buildup and allowing for safe and easy drainage as needed. At some point in October 1984, one of the underground tanks lost its ability to maintain pressure, leaving the toxic chemical sitting unprotected from moisture for 2 whole months before tragedy struck. When MIC comes into contact with water, an instant chemical reaction occurs, producing a deadly gas. On December 2nd, 1984, water entered a side pipe trailing into the unpressurized MIC tank. This pipe was also corroding, shedding iron into the water and adding more substances that all contribute to an even more significant reaction. Around 11 p.m. on December 2nd, workers at the Bhopal Union Carbide plant noticed that pressure in one of the tanks had climbed to 10 psi, which was highly unusual. For unexplained reasons, however, this reading did not prompt the workers to do much of anything at the time. They instead went on a tea break. The workers returned to the tank around 12:40 a.m. and were shocked to see the tank's PSI had risen even higher to 55, an incredibly dangerous level. The workers were enveloped in panic when control room gauges began to signal that gas was leaking. The gas had breached the containment system and had been released. Preventative action was too little, too late. At 12:50 a.m., an alarm was sounded across the plant to alert workers of the danger. Shortly after, an alarm was sounded throughout Bhopal, but it ended as soon as it began, leaving residents oblivious to the nightmare they were about to face. A fog-like cloud covered Bhopal, leading the community to wake to a toxic cloud of blinding gas. A mass panic ensued. Local authorities made no effort to communicate to the thousands of citizens facing an untimely death. The community was made up of generally uneducated, poor individuals who kept to themselves and minded their own. Not having any idea what was going on, most in the city frantically escaped their homes to search for safety, leaving many children and the elderly left behind in the chaos. The dense, toxic fog made seeing and breathing nearly impossible, and the mass panic led thousands of citizens to become trapped in the gas, choking to death or being trampled by those desperate to flee. The nearby hospital was inundated with patients, but in the initial critical phase of the disaster, doctors did not receive any information from officials as to why so many were so gravely afflicted. Without this knowledge, doctors were simply unable to provide a treatment that would have helped the thousands of patients who were dying as each minute passed. It is estimated that nearly 8,000 died within a few days of the leak, while another 8,000 have since died from diseases stemming from the exposure. On top of this, the lasting effects of the exposure left many more gravely disabled or blinded. Prior to the accident, the list of safety violations was extensive and extremely concerning to investigators. A refrigeration system, for example, had been installed to ensure that the gas was kept at a safe temperature, and to mitigate the risk of reactions. However, the system had broken 2 years prior, rendering the feature useless. Additionally, multiple backup defenses were not functioning properly, leaving the growing leak to follow the wind into the surrounding neighborhoods of Bhopal. The impacts of this tragedy are still felt to this day. Groundwater in Bhopal is still contaminated and has continued to cause disabilities in those residing there. Many children of second and third generation descent from those who experienced the disaster have developed a wide array of disabilities, including muscular dystrophy, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, blindness, severe learning impairments, and even attention deficit hyperactive disorder. These conditions have been more common in Bhopal than any other region in India. While these patterns have been observed, many of the medical studies conducted on the long-term effects of the exposure to MIC are unknown. Until 1994, the Indian Council of Medical Research was prohibited from releasing its findings. Even though this date has passed, information released to the public around links to systemic health afflictions in the area have been inconclusive. Some argue that the cause of this gas leak falls directly on negligence and lack of safety precautions taken by Union Carbide. They say that the company knew of the horrendous conditions at the Bhopal plant, especially given that their own investigation found 61 violations prior to the accident. They believe that Union Carbide was aware of the multiple broken failsafes, and yet did not act accordingly to ensure that both their own workers and the citizens living around the plant were protected from such a tragedy. But arguably, the most devastating fact is that many Bhopal victims believe that they were abandoned while they endured the repercussions of the company's failures and will unfortunately continue to live with and pass on the impacts for years to come. My name is Scott, and thank you so much for watching. We are Mystery Syndicate. If you like what we do, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Leave a comment and give this video a like. And to be notified when we post new videos, hit that notification bell. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Patreon. And for exclusive merchandise, visit our website at www.mysterysyndicate.com. From all of us at Mystery Syndicate, thank you again. We sincerely appreciate your support.